Okay, so again, Q&A afterwards. The second thing I wanted to talk about, I mentioned at the top of the press conference, is my referral to the district attorney's office for the use of force investigation. I want to be clear that I have full faith in the ability and impartiality of the Salinas Police Department to conduct an investigation of its own personnel. As I've said many times in the past, we've done these routinely, we do them thoroughly, we do them with integrity. Our cases are critical of our own actions, where they need to be and should be, and in fact have resulted in the arrest by Salinas police officers, of Salinas police officers, for what we determined to be unlawful shootings. I also understand that today, in the current climate, locally and nationally, there's a great deal of trust issues between the community and law enforcement, and specifically around law enforcement's ability to police itself. So with that in mind, as I said earlier, I've invited the Monterey County District Attorney to investigate any criminal acts by Salinas police officers in the arrest of Mr. Velasco. And they have agreed to and will be assuming that investigation immediately. A few minutes ago, I talked about Mr. Velasco being diagnosed with specified drug-induced psychotic disorder. And I want to address that relative to understanding use of force in law enforcement. It's important to understand that when police officers confront violence in progress, they do not address the cause of the violence itself, like drug-induced psychotic disorder. They address the violence itself. Their goal and our policy is to use only the force needed to stop the violence and to make an arrest. In those moments of crisis, when the violence is happening, police officers do not have the luxury of wondering if this is a methamphetamine-induced event, a psychotic-induced event, an anger-induced event. Their responsibility is to protect victims, protect the public, and stop the violence. The fact of the matter is, Salinas police officers confront mentally ill people every day. The overwhelming majority of people with mental health issues are contacted without incident every day. Just about a week ago, we had a man hold himself hostage with a knife in a cemetery. Called us and asked us to kill him. Made threats like, I want to die, and I know that if I take my knife and charge at you, you'll shoot me. That's how it works. He was in a cemetery, isolated. We had time to deploy resources out there. He was not actively violent. He was clearly mentally ill. In fact, we've dealt with this gentleman before in similar circumstances. We had time to secure the area. We had time to get our crisis team out there. We had time to get behavioral health professionals out there. We had time to get our hostage negotiators out there. We had time to take less lethal munitions that we can deploy on the scene. We were there for about 45 minutes. We negotiated with him. He surrendered, and he went to the hospital with no use of force being necessary. On April 15th, less than a month ago, Mr. Velasco himself waved down two police officers who were on patrol and told them that people were trying to kill him. The police officers saw that he was acting erratically. They called for paramedics and an ambulance. They called for a couple more officers. They evaluated Mr. Velasco, and while he was agitated and acting strangely, he was not under the influence of any drugs. They questioned him a little further, asked him again if he wanted to hurt himself or if he believed people were trying to hurt him. And he said no, he just wanted help getting medication. And so Salinas police officers arranged for transportation in an ambulance to the hospital where he got his necessary care. Even in Mr. Velasco's case, the Salinas Police Department, when called upon in a non-violent situation, was able to assist Mr. Velasco getting the help that he needed. So again, I'd like to emphasize that when officers respond to a violent incident, They have to respond to the violence itself and deal with the cause of the violence later. The objective is to overcome any resistance or violence, effect an arrest, and keep the public safe. So if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to take those.
Chief, in the video, we see repeated hits towards Mr. Velasco. In the protocol, is there any limit, or what would have taken for the officers to stop hitting him?
Well, like I said, the policy is, and our goal is, to use the amount of force necessary to overcome resistance and effect an arrest. And so the question you just posed is a question the district attorney will pose to the officers during their investigation, a question we will pose to the officers administratively through an internal affairs process on why did you strike him in the first place? Why did you strike him? Where you struck him? How many times? Why did you strike him as many times as you did? And based on those responses, the DA will make an assessment of whether criminal charges are appropriate or not, and we will make an assessment of whether administrative or disciplinary action is appropriate.
Do you feel that anything inappropriate was done?
I have not made a determination yet. Felix?
Chief, the family is asking for a federal investigation. Your thoughts on that? And is that something that a request would come from your office?
I'm not aware that a federal investigation is appropriate at this time. I mean, I don't, typically, federal agencies don't investigate this kind of conduct. It's typically investigated locally. If the federal government chooses to open an investigation, that is their right and their option. I don't believe that it's necessary. I believe Salinas police officers could conduct that investigation, but again, understanding the trust issues, I think it's more important and legitimate in the eyes of the public that we give it to an independent body, and that's why I requested the local district attorney to conduct an investigation. But any federal agency is welcome to come in and examine our processes.
The family has contended that he has schizophrenia and depression. Now, aside from the incident in April, anything else, has that been confirmed by outside medical care experts?
The medical documents we have provides the diagnosis I just described to you. And that's really all the information. Yes, ma'am.
While these investigations are going on, are these officers on administrative leave? Are there plans for them to be on administrative leave?
They are one officer, and this is the officer that comes in at the end of the video, and I think seems to be the one who causes the most concern in the video. He is not on administrative leave, but he is restricted to working in the station. He's not going to have any enforcement role right now. Roy?
Were those all of the 911 calls?
Yes, as far as we know.
And are you're going to hand out transcripts or downloads or something?
We're going to provide a Dropbox link, so you'll have all the audio and the transcript.
And will the times of the calls be attached?
I don't think the times of the calls are attached, but they are, as best we can tell, sequential, and you can hear that. It makes sense if you listen to them in order. That the first calls just report him being in the street, then mom's call, and then calls reporting him dealing with mom, and then the latter calls you can hear the sirens already en route. So
Would it be difficult to attach the times?
I think it would be. I mean, we could get it, but it's going to take some doing.
The response times in the chronology is basically indecipherable without times. It needs to be done.
We're releasing them in a sequence as far as we're able to determine. And what we want to do is get them out as fast as we can. We're going to be sending that link around immediately after this press conference. But if you'd like timestamps, we'll consult and see if we can get them.
It's very likely that many of these calls came in simultaneously. It's why you hear several call takers taking these calls.
Also, let me correct something I said earlier. I said there were 14. There's a total of 15.
Have there been any threats made against these officers after this video surfaced?
Well, there have been threats made against the police department. We're aware that Mr. Velasco has some pretty substantial gang ties, and in monitoring social media, we're seeing some threats against law enforcement.
And how are you guys handling that? Any additional,
That would be irresponsible for us to comment on.
Chief,
Yes, sir.
I understand that 3 out of the 5 officers who responded Friday night had crisis intervention training.
Correct.
To what degree did you see that type of training reflected in how they handled the situation?
Well, again, they're dealing with an actively violent individual who's assaulting a person. So in that moment, it's really difficult, and you could hear, I think, pretty clearly in the third call what Mr. Velasco's condition was, ability to communicate was, and so their first obligation is to stop the violence, protect that woman, protect the community. Afterwards, you know, they got him secured and ended up, I think we've seen the video now with the spit sock on his head because he was spitting and lashing around, had some blood. And they were transported him to the hospital. That's where that kind of process comes in. Where that CIT training is really effective, right, is like the cemetery incident I described. In a contained situation where you have a chance to have a dialogue. If a person's in crisis and hurting someone, I think it's almost absurd to say, we would not expect a police officer to let violence continue while we try to negotiate with someone, while we ask questions like, you know, are you psychotic? Can we help you with your mental health issues? If someone's getting beat up, they have to stop that. In circumstances where we can communicate, it's incredibly successful, and the CIT training is really helpful. It's talked people off of bridges, it's talked people out of hurting themselves, but in circumstances where conditions allow for that conversation. Royal?
One of the callers at the end says that several other people were taking video of the arrest. Have you heard of it? Have you found it?
Yeah, so thank you for mentioning that. We have the one video, I saw another of his video or still posted on I believe it, well, on another channel. But the one caller did say several people were out there taping. We believe there was a high school graduation going on at Sherwood Hall at the time, so there were people around. I find it remarkable that more video has not surfaced. And so I would ask your viewers and your readers that if they have that video, we would like to see it. And if they're uncomfortable sending it to us, they can post it however they can post it, but we would like to be made aware of that. We don't have anything to fear. We want to gather all the information that we can out of these videos, and so to the extent that it's out there, we're really interested in gathering.
Can you elaborate? You saw there was another one somewhere. I didn't catch what you were saying.
Yeah, I saw one other video on Channel 7 on ABC last night that was the first time I had seen it. I don't know if we're actually in possession of that video yet.
What's your overall message to the community, especially the Latino community who already has a hard time trusting law enforcement?
Well, okay, so specifically to the Latino community, and I understand, and the Salinas Police Department well understands the long history of trust and disparate treatment. And frankly, I'm very proud of the strides that we've made over several years, even predating the 2014 shootings, to reach out and make those deep connections by placing officers in affected neighborhoods, by doing legitimacy training. We're now looking at even the way we deploy our patrol officers to make sure that they're more oriented towards making connections with the community. I think in this, I mean, I really struggle to see any some racial strife in this, because it was just the individual we were dealing with. This was just a violent man as far as these officers were concerned. But the message to this community remains. The Salinas Police Department is committed to principles of social justice, to equal and fair treatment under the law, and we are committed to holding ourselves accountable to those standards.
Are you looking for some additional training to officers right now?
We are in a constant and ongoing training phase. Academically, in terms of law and best practices, physically, in terms of use of force techniques, that's an ongoing process here. And more to your point, we do review all of these incidents critically, just like we do after any tactical incident, and determine if we need to freshen up training in a certain area or retrain the department in a certain area. We haven't made any specific recommendations based on this incident, but that is something that we do. Let's go over here for a second.
So my question is, why is it justifiable to continue hitting someone repeatedly while they're on the ground being apprehended? You were saying that he was still kicking, right? Or why was the fifth officer still hitting him when he was on the ground being apprehended by 4 officers?
So,
Or is there something we're not seeing on the video?
okay, well, I'm not sure if you've got the count right, but I think I understand the thrust of your question is, which is why when he's down on the ground, somebody else shows up and starts hitting him. That's
Right.
basically your question, right? That's what the investigation is built to determine. Now, without speaking directly to this, I will tell you that a person on the ground does not mean they've surrendered. A person on the ground does not mean they're not dangerous, does not mean they're in custody, it just means they're on the ground. I had my nose broken one time by a guy who was on the ground, but kicked me and hit me in the nose, broke my nose. So there is a lot to controlling a person, and just because they're on the ground does not mean they're not still dangerous.
So are you saying the investigation is surrounding the fifth officer's actions or as a whole, the incident as a whole?
That's really a question appropriate for the DA who's going to be doing it. My assumption is they will look at everyone's actions. Sarah?
I want to follow up on the investigation question, and if you could clarify what it is the DA is investigating. You described that they're investigating whether criminal acts were committed, which seems like what they always determine when there's a use of force investigation. Or are they doing the complete investigation top to bottom? Are you also doing an internal affairs investigation? Who's doing what? Exactly?
Right, okay, so a little bit of technical background here. In any use of force incident, from an officer-involved shooting down to a simple scuffle with a drunk driver that ends up with people falling down and scraping their cheek, is investigated 2 ways. The criminal act that got us there, so maybe a DUI, and then an administrative investigation into the use of force. And we conduct those investigations anytime force is used beyond mere laying on of hands and consensual handcuffing, if that makes sense. So if we end up shoving somebody, if we end up taking someone to the ground, the typical routine is that a supervisor will respond to investigate the use of force. We have an administrative document we fill out. It goes through 3 layers of review to determine whether that use of force is within policy, and then it gets filed. In this case, we're clearly beyond that, in my opinion, clearly beyond that level of investigation. And to address the community concerns that these were police officers who were beating a man, you've all seen the various descriptions, beating a man for no reason. The officers were out of control. Whatever people feel about this, in order to address that, I've asked the DA to step up to a much more detailed level of investigation. So this will essentially look like the equivalent of an officer-involved shooting investigation. So again, the Salinas Police Department investigating the criminal conduct of Mr. Velasco, the Monterey County District Attorney's Office investigating any criminal wrongdoing on the part of the police officers in the use of force, in taking Mr. Velasco into custody. Just like they would in an officer-involved shooting, where we would investigate the acts of the person who was shot, typically involved in a crime. And we separately and parallel investigate the conduct of the police officers to make sure that shooting was lawful. And then always an administrative separate investigation that deals only with policy violations. So is that clear? Sir?
Yes. So is every individual who responded being investigated for potential policy violations here? Or just that last
Policy
question?
violations and criminal violations.
Okay.
Yeah. Nick had a question.
What other uses of force were deployed up to that point? How many tasers were deployed to help bring Mr. Velasco into custody?
So you heard the lowest level of force that we use, which is our presence and our voices. You heard officers commanding him to roll over, to stop. They laid on hands, physical force, hand-to-hand techniques. My understanding is that each officer deployed taser probes, and one officer attempted to drive stun Mr. Velasco to no effect. and of course, the use of batons. Felix?
Chief, 3 years ago, you pleaded guilty to assaulting an officer. By chance, was that officer any one of the 5 officers involved?
I don't know. I'm not familiar with that case, so I couldn't tell you. Right.
In the past, people in your department have expressed concern about how long it takes the district attorney's office to conduct investigations. At one point, they were like more than a year behind in investigations into fatal actors. Do you have reason to believe that they can finish this investigation before the statute of limitations on criminal action expires?
Yes.
What is the statute?
On felony conduct, 7 years.
So, 7 years. Are you concerned though about the priority that they will sign?
Well, I'll tell you, I will tell you, I'm concerned with the length of time it's taken to get an answer on the officer-involved shootings. But I will also tell you, because I'm in the same boat as the district attorney, they're understaffed, they're overworked. They have had managerial personnel reassignments. So some of their top leadership has retired and new leadership has taken their place. So in essence, that process has to start over with some of these reviews. So structurally, it's just hard for them to push this stuff out. And I say that with all sympathy because we deal with the parallel version of that at Salinas Police Department is on a Friday night, if you call because your next door neighbor's got the music up real loud having a party, it's going to be 5, 6, 7 hours, if at all, before a police officer gets there because we don't have the personnel.
Will you ask them to make this a priority?
What's that?
Will you ask them to make this a priority?
I think they understand that's a part of it.
There was a video posted yesterday and they show police putting a plastic bag on Velasco's head. Is that a standard protocol and what is the purpose?
Okay, let's be really clear. That's not a plastic bag. It's called a spit sock, and it's a nylon mesh bag. And I think the name pretty well defines what it does. It's designed to keep people from spitting. A common thing for someone in handcuffs is to spit. So it's designed in this case because he did have a head laceration. There was blood. In fact, all of the officers were treated for blood exposure. And so that was just to prevent any blood-borne pathogens from being contaminated, from being passed on.
Kind of going back to what you were talking about, keeping lines of communication open with the community, we're seeing a lot more response on social media, people asking questions. Can you talk about that, please? Well, again, in the days running up to our events today, our press conference today, my concern has been, and this is my concern generally, is that people watch, what is it, a minute and 30-second video, and assume they know what happened, and they don't. That's just the reality. They've got a little picture of it, they've got a snippet of it, but they don't know what happened before. They don't know, like you guys have a better sense of what it sounded like in the act because there's no relevant audio on that video clip. They don't know, did not know what his state of intoxication or mental health status was, as we didn't. Viewers of that video didn't know what happened afterwards. And so I get how people respond emotionally to violence. You know, we go to the movies every weekend to watch really violent films, pay good money to do it. We play Xbox games that are really violent, and that's entertainment. But the fact of the matter is, watching actual violence is difficult. It's hard because you know it's real. And so to the extent that people respond emotionally to that, I completely understand. I had an emotional response to that video. I don't imagine anybody could watch it and not have an emotional response. But I also been in this business long enough to know that is but a fraction of the story, and that's really the important part. Felix.
Chief, drug-induced psychotic disorder, what does that mean?
That was written by a psychiatrist, so you're going to have to ask them. That just came off the medical records. I mean, I have my opinion about what that means, but I'm a police officer, not a doctor.
In simple terms, does it mean that once he does drugs, he goes into this psychotic meltdown or breakdown?
I don't know if it means that. I don't know if it means that using drugs causes it, or if, and I suspect this is probably more the case, long-term use has caused a psychotic condition, whether he's under the influence or not. Because in the April case where I mentioned he needed help, the officers approached him and at first thought that he was under the influence. And then when they did the evaluation, and there's a way we can evaluate people, it turns out he wasn't. But a lot of the characteristics he displayed led the officers to think that he was under the influence. And it turns out that he wasn't, but he was having that event. So I suspect, and you'll have to confirm this medically, that his condition is as a result of long-term methamphetamine use, or whatever drug seems to be the choice. Yes,
I
ma'am?
have two short questions. When police arrived, a lot of calls were saying he's walking through traffic, he's being harassed. What did they see when they first arrived? What was he doing? Was he beating her up? Was he running through traffic? Was he jumping?
As reported to me, the first police officers were in Sherwood Gardens, and they heard the call come out, so they did not drive in. They actually ran across from Sherwood Gardens. And what those officers saw was Mr. Velasco on top of his mother with his hands either at her neck or her shirt, pushing her up and down. And that's been described as slamming her up and down. That's been described as rocking back and forth variously. So.
And then how long did it take? I heard on the 911 call that he said about 4 times, get on your stomach, get down, he didn't respond. How long did it take for them to use a taser?
To use a taser?
Right, I mean, how was it?
Was it immediate? I don't know that. I don't have sequence of events down to seconds and minutes.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
I don't know if there's anyone from the DA's office.
Sarah, you know.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, if there's anyone from the DA's office here that can talk about, I know that he was originally a parole violation, any sort of new charges that he could be facing.
That's a DA question. I'm sorry. Sarah.
I want to go back to the question about investigations on use of force that ranges, it sounds like, from shoving with hands to shooting. How many such investigations do you do here a year?
I have it. I don't have it with me, but I can get that to you. If we can somebody make a note to get that.
And I would also be
we got a couple years of
interested
information on
in a
this.
subset of that, which would be how many for the use of batons? As in this case.
Yeah, we break it.
Okay.
The way, so I'll be happy to send that information out, and the way we break it out, because as we described earlier, in this case, you could clearly articulate 4 levels of force: voice, hands, tasers, and the batons. And so when you see the way we report this, you will see them reported as at the highest level of force. So this would be reported in that scheme as use of baton. And you'd have to get into the narrative of this stuff in order to understand how many other options were out there.
And
Go ahead.
Can I just ask 2 more questions? One, do you have any more detail on the injuries? When we talked a few days ago, you said that Mr. Velasco might have had a broken bone, and you had 2 officers who were injured but back on duty. Any follow-up or more specifics?
So I don't have any more on Mr. Velasco other than I think my original description was accurate. Yeah, so fractured leg, bruising to arms and legs, and again, those are, per our training, the appropriate zones to be struck. Long muscle groups, big muscle groups, try not to strike the joints, try to avoid the torso, and try to avoid the head and the spinal column. In terms of injuries to the officers, the one officer that took the baton strike to the arm is back to work. The officer that injured his knee is not at work, but we anticipate him coming back pretty soon.
And then my other question is, can you tell us who the officer is who is currently on office duty?
No, and I'm not going to do that because of the threats against the police officers generally, and I think everyone would agree that the logical conclusion in identifying him would be zero those threats down onto him. Royal.
Can you help me understand something? Because when we listened to the 911 calls earlier, and I could have until I had a worker, I'm an old guy, I don't get things right on. But wasn't the call from the mother and then the officers and saying, don't move, get on your, that was an early call, right?
It was the 3rd call.
Okay, and then we're told that those calls were chronological. So then we have several calls of people reporting he's running around, he's acting crazy. The cops aren't here yet. That makes no sense, does it? What am I missing?
Well, no, because chronological and or simultaneous. It's really common when our dispatchers put out a call that says we're getting multiple reports of gunfire, we're getting multiple reports of a major accident. Because if a crash happens, everybody in this room has a cell phone, we're all likely as good citizens to pick up and call at the same time. And so I suspect a lot of those calls came in very close to or simultaneously.
This could be why it could be blurry at the times. I mean, nobody's really challenged
Right.
the chronology, but it's.
No, I understand.
It makes a lot of sense.
Two questions. You know, Sarah asked about the name of the officer. What can you tell? How long has he been on the force?
I don't know exactly, he's a veteran officer.
Rough, you know,
I
years?
think in the 10 to 13 years, to 14 years range.
Has he been in any officer-involved shootings before, anything like that?
I don't have that with me right now, and I'm not prepared to discuss that.
And-
I guess.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh,
No.
And then, was there any other agencies involved? There were reports or people commenting on Twitter and whatnot that CHP showed up. Was there any other agencies outside Salinas PD to show up to the event?
Not as far as I'm aware. I had never heard anything about the highway patrol.
My understanding was that none of the officers were wearing body cameras
Yeah.
or dash cams. Have you guys reached out to businesses to see if their
Yes.
surveillance, is that something that you guys are planning on releasing or anything?
Well, if
that
we
is
had
now?
something to release, we would. As it turns out, that none of the cameras in the area, of those that were functioning, they did not capture any of this, remarkably. There was one camera that probably could have, but it was obstructed by a portion of the building, so there's nothing. Again, more importantly, right, for people to, if they have that video, we'd like to see it. Even if they don't think it's relevant, I would say, send it to us or post it and let us make that assessment.
Will this sort of now expedite the training to get all of your officers up to speed with the body cameras?
Well, I mean, we can't expedite it anymore. It's already scheduled. The trainers, the factory trainers who will train our trainers should be here next week, and then the training should go very quickly thereafter. I will tell you that since this incident, officers have been lining up to get cameras. They want to take them out, even without the training. Show me how to turn it on, and I'll wear it. And unfortunately, we did not have any in-car video out there.
One last question. The other day, you said HIPAA and other reasons prevented you from making any comment on all of Mr. Velasco's mental stage, previous mental history. What has changed between that?
What has changed between then and now is Mr. Velasco provided us with a signed medical release credits.
Thanks.
Felix?
Chief, now that you've launched this, or you asked the DAs to come in and do this criminal investigation, some might question why more officers aren't off duty and maybe on leave.
The decision to put officers off duty or on leave is my decision to make, and my criteria is based on, do I think they represent, among a variety of things, do they represent an ongoing threat to the community? Was there something in their conduct that lawfully prevents them from being police officers? Do I believe they are guilty of crimes? Just a variety of things. In this case, I think the appropriate action, and the action I took is to bring one officer into the police department on restricted duty, and the other ones are available for patrol.
Does the officers involved receive CIT training?
Three of the officers on the scene were CIT trained, and I think the number departmentally is 78%. Spencer?
Yes, the last time I checked about a month or so ago was 78% of the officers have received CIT training on our way towards our goal of 100%.
The goal being 100%, of course, that's difficult when you have constant hiring and constant retirements, so, and those CIT academies occur only a couple of times a year. Felix?
The one on desk duty, is he CIT trained?
Yes, he is.
What is it, administrative duties, he's working as a clerk, what is he, I mean,
He'll be doing duties inside the police department. We have a lot of things that people who are assigned to station duty and light duty do. They can still take reports. They can investigate. A lot of crimes can be investigated over the phone. They can clear calls.
But
They
he
can
won't be on
assist
the
with
street.
hiring. What's that?
But he won't be on.
He will not be on the street. That's
On the
correct.
street.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.